After the chameleon reforms of the 4th century BC, the Roman army of the 3rd century BC had gone through a drastic change since the 4th century BC. This is possibly due to the many conflicts that Rome had faced during the 4th century BC, such as the wars with the Samnites, Etruscans, Greek city-states, Italians, and Latin tribes. Because of these conflicts with their neighbors, it is highly believed that the Roman military changed by the 3rd century BC, possibly into a more practical design compared to the earlier century. In such, the military system of the Roman units in the 4th century BC had either been incorporated into new units or were outright removed entirely. An example of this is with the leves ascensi and rorii, in which could have been incorporated into other military units, as the leves and ascensi would have been formed and mashed together. That would make the Roman velites, while the rorii would have been incorporated into the hastati. In fact, in the 3rd century BC, the arms and armor of the Roman army changed entirely from the previous century. The Roman Centurion of the 3rd century BC is when we start to see an actually huge difference between a centurion and an everyday foot soldier. For example, the Centurion of the 4th century BC was always mistakenly identified as a triarii in so much of a way that they were impossible to tell apart from one another. While in the 3rd century BC, we start to see a huge difference between the triarii and centurions, possibly to make them more noticeable on the field of battle. However, by the time of the 2nd century BC, they were way more noticeable on the field of battle. Wool tunics would be worn as an every style of occasion of garment, and in such came in multiple designs of colors, rather than just one uniform coloration design. The footwear that would be worn wouldn't be the infamous caligae until later centuries, possibly into the 2nd or said 1st century BC, possibly because of the style of Roman military change. As in the 3rd century, the Roman Republic wouldn't change their form of footwear until later on. The Roman centurions would actually wear a pair of greaves. Now, there are accounts that most soldiers could afford a pair of greaves. However, centurions could actually afford both. While in such, other military units, not so much. There are accounts of padded garments being used. However, some historians do argue on what they actually looked like, leading to some believe that it was probably just that of a woolen tunic. The lorica armata is one of the most infamous type of armor that the Roman military copied from the Celts, as there are accounts that the Romans acquired this armor mainly by fighting against the Celts of Gaul, or possibly in northern Italy. It is unknown, though, of how they did or when acquired it, but, to say the least, the Roman military would later use it on throughout the centuries. As well, a doublet would be worn over the shoulders in order to provide more protection, especially from downward chopping blows, like that from a Celtic sword, or even that of a falcata, or even that of a copus, depending on what the warrior was using upon them. Some written scriptures even describe that of a linal thorax being worn. I, however, have not exactly found any identification to this, so I'm not going to include that in general. However, possibly during the early 3rd century, maybe, but by the later 3rd century, possibly not by then. The belts of the Centurion were actually fully decorated. Some accounts even stated of bronze, brass, and even metal of even gold. Or sometimes even that of gems were even placed inside of the said belts, possibly to show off in the field of battle. This, however, would later change by the later centuries. The sword of the Roman military at this point was actually the infamous Gladius Delius, or Gladius Gallius. This was a sword of the Roman military from the 4th to about all the way into the 1st century AD. It is unknown though how long this sword was used, but it is indicated that this sword had started to fall out of favor by the time of the 2nd century BC. The Roman Centurion helmets were of a mixed design, as there are accounts of them using Italo-Corinthian, Thracian, Greek, Macedonian, or various other designs, something to show off in the field of battle, mainly of a form of feather plume. So the Italo-Corinthian helmet is a better example. The Roman scutum shield was the infamous shield of the Roman military. This type of shield was actually heavily designed and heavily reinforced with a central reinforcement bar. This design, as you see here, would be used from the Roman military even before the 4th century BC, possibly starting around the 5th or even 6th century BC, and all the way into the 1st century AD. And finally, the pilum. The pilum was the infamous Roman throwing javelin. This style of weapon was copied from the Celts of Iberia. However, during the 4th and 3rd century, many historians argue on how the Romans acquired this form of throwing weapon.
Bóg nam speri Ammarius quad mare regnamus, Ammarius quad mare regnamus, audite Romani, audite Romani, secundum captum est, secundum captum est, ero aute censeo, Carthagines delenda